Gillian Prior, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the National Centre for Social Research, to kick off with the first presentation.
Thank you. I'm going to start by really just talking about social attitudes, why are they important, and then some points about how to measure social attitudes, and then looking at some case study data which I think hopes to sort of show how valuable measuring attitudes can be. So to start with, I'm from the National Centre for Social Research. We're Britain's largest independent social research agency, founded in 1969 with the aim purely of carrying out rigorous social research for the benefit of society. We cover all ranges of survey methods and also other methods, mixed method, qualitative, deliberative, and so on. Carry out a wide range of studies for government clients, public sector, universities, and so on. We have particular expertise in sort of large-scale national probability surveys. And we're perhaps best known for our British Social Attitudes Study, which is a long-running monitor of social attitudes, which I will talk a bit more about in a minute. So on to measuring social attitudes. So to start with, what are social attitudes? And here's, I think, a fairly sort of standard definition. So they're the feelings, beliefs, evaluations, and predispositions that individuals or groups hold towards social issues, other people, institutions, cultures, or societal norms. So it's not quite the same as opinions. Opinions are more the expression of attitudes, and it's obviously not the same as behaviours. But they do shape how people interpret the social world and influence how they behave within it. So why do we want to survey social attitudes? So as I said on the previous slide, I think they're an important part of our social world. We can't really fully understand people and society if we only look at behaviour. We need to actually look at why people are doing what they do. We all have sort of beliefs and values, and these shape our view of the social world and how we interact within it. So it's not an alternative to carrying out behavioural research, but it's a complement to it. And they matter because they're important to policymakers, so we don't want a situation where you have kind of government by opinion poll. We elect governments to make decisions on behalf of the public, but it's important for policymakers to actually understand what people think about different issues. Then giving the public a voice. So I think this is a really important feature of social surveys, because we're really speaking to the general public, and if you look at ways in which what the public think can be brought to the attention of those in power, they're perhaps more limited. So generally the sort of views you hear in public tend to come from those who are in power, such as politicians, journalists, and other people of that nature. So really sort of understanding what people think gets behind those perhaps more dominant voices and gives us a true understanding. But attitudes can be hard to measure. And there's a number of kind of issues here which I think need to be thought about, particularly when you're evaluating survey evidence and seeing how valuable you think it is. So one important thing is, first of all, the sort of question of partiality or impartiality. So who's asking the questions? Who's funding the questions? Why are they doing it? Is there someone with a vested interest in getting a particular response or outcome? Then looking on to quality. So there's a lot of different aspects of quality, but some key things. What are the questions that are being asked? What's the sample? Who's being asked? And how was the question worded? Then attitudes can often be complex, so you can't reduce something to a sort of very simplistic one question often. So asking groups of questions which perhaps tackle something from different angles is valuable in terms of actually getting to an underlying closer to the truth as you can. Then the value of trends is important. So monitoring something consistently over a long period and looking for changes over time gives you that sort of real perspective in terms of how society is changing and whether sort of short-term changes do actually hold out in the longer term and so on. So how to sort of try and best measure social attitudes? So first of all, writing good survey questions is critical. A key point is keep language simple. So remember, the average reading age of UK adults is estimated to be 9 to 11 years. So keep simple language in questions, avoid jargon, be specific rather than asking vague questions. Then there's a lot of potential pitfalls in how questions are worded. So avoid things like negative phrasing. It's actually very difficult to think, do you agree or disagree with something worded negatively? Double-barrel questions. So these are where you're asking two different questions in the same question. So that people might answer two aspects in different ways. Leading questions, this is where question wording encourages a specific answer, so avoid that. Then other things that can cause biases. So one is question order. So here's where the order questions are presented in can influence responses. Social desirability biases is a tendency of people to answer in a way that they think is acceptable rather than actually what they truly think. And then acquiescence is just a tendency just to agree with things that are put to people. So then on to who to survey. So, and I'm going to sort of make a pitch for the importance, particularly of random probability samples, as the best way to actually get high quality evidence. But certainly representative samples are very important. And there's some quotes on the slide here from different organisations really in favour of probability sampling. So the first one is from the American Association of Opinion Research, where it says that researchers should avoid non-probability online panels when one of the research objectives is to accurately estimate population values. And I don't know if people are aware, but a lot of the sort of polls and surveys that you see in the press are gathered on commercial online panels, which tend to use non-probability methods, and they use opt-in methods so people can, opt in to take part on that panel. So that's the kind of, I guess, what I'm comparing with. Then a bit of a story, if people remember the 2015 general election. So this was a case where the opinion polls up to the election had suggested it would be a very close result between Labour and Conservative, with likely no overall majority. But in fact, it was a clear win for Conservative. So there was a big debate about the fact that the polling called the election wrong. And Professor Patrick Sturgis led an inquiry into the myths, and one of his key conclusions was that it was because of unrepresentative samples, or that was a key factor in why the the polls were wrong. Then some more recent work, for example, Pew in the USA said that on average the error on opt-in samples was about twice that of probability-based samples. So it's really the non-probability samples are just increasing the risk of error in your results. Just a drink. Excuse me. So why does this matter? So as I said, most opinion research is done using online panels, and as I said, most of these use non-probability methods, and often this is because probability methods, to be honest, are more expensive, they can be slower, and so on. So you can understand why the appeal of the large online panels. However, what the real concern here is about how well the sample represents the population concerned. So if the sample is less representative, there's a higher risk of bias in the results, like the election example I mentioned. It's possible to do things like set quota controls, do weighting to make a sample look representative in terms of key demographics, for example. But these techniques can often actually hide within cell biases on things like education, which actually can still bias the results. And then obviously, of course, if it's an online panel, people who aren't comfortable online aren't or digitally excluded are excluded from the sample. And this is important because often these features are things that are really associated with outcomes of interest to social researchers and to policymakers. And often it's the sort of most vulnerable groups in our society who are excluded from these kind of online surveys. And again, they're ones of particular interest for policymakers and so on. Then an increasing risk or problem really with commercial panels is that of bogus respondents. So bogus respondents are people who are either deliberately fraudulent or insincere or mischievous, who answer perhaps with minimal effort in order to get incentive payments, people who create multiple personas for the same survey, and even can be AI generated. And this is really a growing problem for non-probability online panels because, as I said, they use opt-in recruitment. And although they spend a lot of effort to weed out fraudulent respondents, I think they're thinking that now that can evade the kind of current detection methods, so they're perhaps one step behind technology and people. So in terms of collecting public attitudes, I'm going to talk about British social attitudes as a case study. So brief history, British social attitudes has run almost every year since 1983. It's carried out by the National Centre for Social Research. So we have over 40 years of data on social attitudes in Britain. Its purpose has always been to, what we say, monitor the climate, not the weather. So we're looking at long-term trends, not short-term reactions to different politicians or governments or so on. So we place a lot of strength on having consistent questions over time. It's funded by multiple different funders, including government, some grant funding, and so on. We aim to always use robust methods, and it's often actually been called the gold standard of attitudinal research. And there's several factors behind this. One is the sampling, so it's a cross-sectional survey. We go to fresh people each wave, and it uses random probability sampling based on the postcode address file, which is a list of all postal addresses in the country. So each household has a known chance of being selected for participation. As I said, we rely on using, or have an aim to use long-running questions so that we can track attitudes over time. We collect a lot of demographic and background information which enables detailed subgroup analysis. We also have a very sort of robust questionnaire development process, so we carry out different ways of testing of new questions, including cognitive testing, which is a more sort of in-depth understanding, and then actual piloting of surveys before we go live. Traditionally, BSA was conducted using face-to-face in-home interviews, which was for a long time the predominant method for carrying out high-quality surveys in the UK. Since the COVID pandemic in 2020, we've moved to a push-to-web method, which is an online invited sample, still using probability methods. And we offer a telephone option for those who are unable or unwilling to complete online. So, I want to look at some key trends which I think really sort of help to show why this sort of data is so valuable. So the first one shows attitudes towards same-sex relationships and premarital sex. And this is something we've been asking since the survey began in 1983. And this is really one of the biggest shifts in attitudes we've seen over the period. So the top line shows the percentage of people who say that premarital sex is not wrong at all. And the second line, the percentage who say that same-sex relations or relations between two adults of the same sex are not wrong at all. And you can see over the period, the overall picture is one of increasing tolerance. So overall, the proportion saying sex between two adults of the same sex is not wrong at all increased from a low of 11% in 1987 up to 67% in 2022, which is the last time we asked this question. So we have also found in the study increasing sort of liberal or tolerant issues on a range of other questions, such as gender roles, women working, and so on. So this does seem to be a sort of long-term social shift. And for those of you who remember the early 1980s, the idea of sort of same-sex marriage being legal would have been inconceivable at that time. But it's interesting to look at the pattern over time. So you can see the low point in the early years of the survey, the attitudes towards same-sex relations, not wrong at all, actually went down. And this actually was in the late 1980s, when perhaps the concern about HIV and AIDS was at its peak. Since then, fairly steady increase, and things like in 2014 is when same-sex marriage was legalised. You can see a sort of jump in support, kind of coinciding with that policy change. However, I think it doesn't mean that we're more liberal about all sorts of sexual relationships, because if I then add on this line at the bottom is people who say that a married person having sexual relations with someone other than his or her partner is not wrong at all. And this is only 1 to 2% agreeing with that, and that really hasn't changed at all over this period. So another question that we have long-term trends on is how important or unimportant do you think it is for Britain to continue to have a monarchy? So this was first asked in 1983 when 86% said it was very or quite important. Then it seemed so uncontroversial that it wasn't actually asked again until 1994, by which time the proportion had fallen considerably. And the early 1990s was perhaps quite a few difficult years for the monarchy, with things like the divorce of Charles and Diana and so on. Since then, attitudes were fairly steady, and actually we saw an increase around 2012 with the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, and again, sustained higher, but since then I think we have reverted to a fairly sort of steady downwards trend in support for the monarchy. And we also find that support is particularly higher amongst older people and lower amongst younger people. So there is a real question of the monarchy and how will it have that appeal for younger generations going forward. Here's one, satisfaction with the NHS, which again we've asked since the beginning. And this is really used, so the King's Fund and Nuffield Trust tend to publish this, they fund this question and publish data annually, and it's really used as a kind of benchmark for how well the NHS is doing with the public. And you can see levels of dissatisfaction reached a new high in our 2024 survey, with nearly 6 in 10 saying they were either very or fairly dissatisfied with the way the NHS runs today. The key point, turning point being after the COVID pandemic in 2020, and I think the real key driver for this is extended waiting times and those sorts of factors that really impact on how people perceive the NHS as performing. So I think, this chart really helps to demonstrate, I think, why this is such a key priority for the government to turn around the NHS, because you can see how poorly it's perceived by the public. Attitudes towards tax and spending, again, this one we've tracked over time. Typically what we found with this is that the attitudes respond in what we call a sort of thermostatic fashion. So if governments cut taxation and spending by a lot, the public notice this and react by wanting taxation and spending not to be cut any further. But then if they get too high and taxes get too high, people again react by wanting levels not to keep going up. So you saw this sort of pattern of up and down throughout the period up to the 2000s. What we've been looking at more recently is, since COVID, how has the public reacted? Because since the COVID pandemic, the levels of public spending have been very, very high. And for the initial years after COVID, we didn't see that thermostatic reaction, so people were still supportive of the high levels of government spending. But I think you can see in the more recent years, so 2023 and 2024, that green line really coming down again. So current level of support is now higher for keeping taxes the same levels now than it is for increasing taxes. But even saying that, the current level of support for higher taxes and spending is still above the 31% that it fell to in 2010, even though, looking as a proportion of GDP, public spending is actually a similar level as it was then. And taxes, I think, are higher as well. And this one, which is people's feelings about their household income, I think helps to explain why this might be. So the top chart is people who say the top line is the people who say they're living comfortably on their income. And that's now down to 35%, to the lowest we've recorded in the study. And the people who say they're neither comfortable nor struggling is the largest group, and those who are struggling has increased. So I think clear evidence of the impact of the cost of living crisis and so on. Final one to look at, this is the trust people place in government to place the needs of the nation above the interests of their party. And we've been looking at this since 1986. So this chart shows the proportion who trust governments to put National Labour Party interests just about always or most of the time. A couple of points here. One is you can see that in the early years of the survey, general elections tended to reset the level of trust. So the general election was seen as a good mechanism, people had their say, the government changed, and trust in government went up. But then you can also see in more recent years, that pattern has fallen down. So in the 2017 election, there was a much smaller uptick post-election, and actually the 2024 election, we didn't see that uptick at all. So the fact of the general election has not reset and has not increased people's trust in government. And actually, only 12% of people now say they trust the government to place the needs of the nation above the needs of their party. And we also saw this reflected in other measures like the proportion who feel the system of government couldn't be improved, which is at its kind of lowest ever level. And this chart shows attitudes towards electoral reform, so people saying we should change the voting system versus the orange line, those we should keep it as it is. So you can see that the decline in the level of trust and confidence in government has appeared to be influencing people's attitudes towards electoral reform. In the early years of the survey, there was a majority support for keeping the system as it is. Up until the early 2020s, when that has turned around, and now we see a majority in favour of changing the system. And interestingly, for the first time, we actually found a majority of supporters of all of the main political parties, including the Conservatives, were now in favour of changing the voting system. So that's for the first time. So it does look like the overall decline in the level of trust and confidence in government has been undermining people's support for actually the method of electing them. So that's a quick whistle through, I think, some interesting trends which I think just show the benefit of long-term high-quality data. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to our website. The data is all available for secondary analysis via the UK Data Service. So yeah, that's the web link there. Thank you.